Chapter 3. The feudal mode of production. Rise of feudalism. Feudalism was widespread. Feudal systems, with regional variations, existed globally, including China, Western Europe, Russia, Transcaucasia, and Central Asia. Feudalism spanned centuries. Its duration varied by region, lasting over 2,000 years in China and centuries in other areas, generally ending between the 17th and 19th centuries. Origins in Western Europe. Feudalism in Western Europe arose from the collapse of the Roman Empire and the changing social structures of conquering Germanic tribes. Colony as precursors. The Roman system of colony, tenant farmers, foreshadowed feudal labor relations, with peasants working land in exchange for payments or a share of the harvest. Fall of Rome and rise of new order. The conquering tribes, Germanic, Gaulish, Slavic, brought their own communal systems, which gradually transitioned to private land ownership and feudal structures. Land ownership shifts. Initially, land was largely communal among the conquering tribes, but over time, individual families acquired private land holdings, leading to wealth disparities. Rise of powerful landowners. Growing inequality allowed wealthy families and military leaders to gain control over land and peasants, who became dependent on them. Kings and the consolidation of power. Military leaders, supported by the aristocracy, became kings, establishing new states and granting land fiefs to loyal followers in exchange for military service. The Church's role. The Church received substantial land holdings and played a key role in supporting royal authority. Feudalism defined. The system of granting land fiefs in exchange for service formed the basis of feudalism, with peasants working the land and owing duties to their lords. Feudalism's rise from the 5th to 10th centuries. The process of feudalization, where peasants lost their land and became serfs, occurred over several centuries in Europe. Causes of peasant dependence. Free peasants were driven into dependence on feudal lords due to constant warfare, economic burdens, taxes, etc., and the need for protection. Land transfer to feudal lords. Peasants often surrendered their land to lords in exchange for protection or had it seized by force and deception, leading to feudal obligations. Consolidation of serfdom. Former slaves, colony, and free peasants eventually merged into a single class of serfs tied to the land and their lord. No land without its lord. This phrase illustrates the complete dominance of the feudal system, with kings as the ultimate landowners. Feudalism as a necessary stage. Feudalism, based on the labor of dependent peasants with some ownership rights, was seen as a crucial step in societal development after the decline of slavery. Variations in societal development. Not all societies go through every stage. Some can skip stages and progress directly to a higher level. Russia's path to feudalism. Russia largely bypassed widespread slave ownership and transitioned from a primitive communal system to feudalism. Eastern Slavonic communities. These communities initially had communal land ownership, but private ownership gradually emerged, leading to inequality and the rise of powerful landowners, boyars. The Church is a major landowner. The Church amassed vast land holdings through donations, grants, and inheritance. Rise of pomesty system. Russian princes and tsars granted land, pomesty, and peasants to their followers, pomeshchiks, in exchange for military service. Enserfment of Russian peasants. Initially, peasants could move between lords, but in 1581, the state restricted this right, binding peasants to the land and their lord. Agricultural advancements. Feudal agriculture, primarily focused on tillage, saw improvements in grain growing and the development of other farming practices. Evolution of farming systems. From fallow and slash-and-burn systems, agriculture progressed to the three-field system, which became dominant for centuries. Improvements in tools. Early feudal tools were basic, wooden plow, sickle, etc., but later, iron plows, harrows, and mills were introduced. Production relations of feudal society. Exploitation of peasants by feudal lords. Feudal production relations. Feudal society's economic foundation rested on the lord's ownership of land and partial ownership of serfs, who were not slaves but were bound to the land. Lord's domain. Part of the land was the lord's domain, worked directly by peasants for the lord's benefit. Peasant holdings. Lords granted peasants land, holdings, under exploitative conditions, ensuring a labor force tied to the land. Extra economic compulsion. Feudal lords maintained direct control over peasants to ensure their labor, as peasants had some degree of ownership over their holdings and tools. Necessary and surplus labor. Peasants divided their labor time between producing for their own needs, necessary labor, and producing surplus product for the lord, surplus labor. Feudal rent. Feudal rent was the surplus labor or product extracted by the lord, often exceeding the peasant's surplus and cutting into their necessary labor time. Forms of feudal rent. Labor rent. Week work peasants worked part of the week on the lord's domain and the rest on their own holdings. Rent in kind. Peasants paid a portion of their produce, grain, livestock, etc., to the lord. Money rent. Peasants paid rent in money, common during the decline of feudalism. Exploitation of peasants. All forms of feudal rent represented the exploitation of peasants by lords. Additional burdens on peasants. Lords often imposed extra charges for using mills, smithies, etc., and peasants also paid taxes to the state and sometimes tithes to the church. Peasant labor as the foundation. Peasant labor was essential for feudal society, providing agricultural produce, crafts, and labor for construction projects. Peasant labor for town building. Towns were constructed through the labor of peasant serfs. Natural economy in early feudalism. Feudal estates were largely self-sufficient, with limited trade, producing most of what they needed internally. Crafts within estates. Larger estates had their own craftsmen, often serfs, who produced necessities like clothing, tools, and weapons. Peasant self-sufficiency. Peasants also maintained a natural economy, engaging in domestic handicrafts like spinning and weaving to meet their needs. Agriculture and handicrafts combined. Feudal economies were characterized by the integration of agriculture as the primary activity, with supporting domestic handicrafts. Growth of trade and specialization. As towns grew, trade and specialization increased, leading to greater division of labor and exchange between town and country. Universal exploitation, with regional variations. While exploitation of peasants was central to feudalism everywhere, specific features varied by region. Eastern feudalism. Eastern feudalism often combined feudal relations with slavery and featured strong state ownership of land. Patriarchal clan relations in the East. Feudal lords in the East utilized existing patriarchal clan structures to further exploit peasants. Land and water control in the East. In regions with irrigated agriculture, feudal control extended to water resources, increasing peasant dependence. Nomadic feudalism. Among nomadic peoples, feudal power was based on control of pastures and livestock, with large-scale cattle ownership translating to land ownership. Basic economic law of feudalism. The core of feudalism was the production of surplus product to satisfy the feudal lord's needs, achieved through the exploitation of dependent peasants based on land ownership and control over serfs. The medieval town. Craft guilds. Merchant guilds towns survived the fall of slavery. Many towns established during the Roman era continued to exist after the fall of the slave-owning system, preserving crafts and trade. Slow early development. Town growth and craft production were initially slow in the early Middle Ages. Craftsmen with land. Early town craftsmen often had small plots of land and engaged in subsistence agriculture, indicating limited market dependence. Emergence of specialized crafts. As craftsmen produced surplus goods, they began to settle in central locations, leading to the growth of new towns and increased specialization. Towns and feudal lords. Towns, often located on feudal lands, were subject to lords' authority and owed them duties and payments. Struggle for town autonomy. Towns fought for and gradually gained self-governance rights, including legal and economic autonomy. Town composition and role. Towns, populated by craftsmen, traders, and escaped serfs, became centers of commodity production and trade, contrasting with the rural natural economy. Craft guilds. Guilds emerged to protect craftsmen's interests, regulate production, and limit competition. They existed in various regions, including Byzantium, Italy, Western Europe, Russia, and the East. Guild structure and functions. Guilds, with master craftsmen as members, controlled production processes, set standards, and provided mutual aid. Guilds' evolving role. Initially beneficial for craft development, guilds later hindered progress by stifling innovation and limiting competition. Social tensions within guilds. Growing exploitation of journeymen and apprentices by masters led to social tensions and the formation of journeymen's brotherhoods. Merchant guilds. Similar to craft guilds, merchant guilds organized trade, regulated commercial practices, and protected merchants' interests. Expansion of trade. Trade between East and West flourished, fueled by the Crusades and the rise of prominent trading centers like Genoa and Venice. The Hanseatic League. This powerful alliance of northern European towns dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas. Impact of trade on feudalism. Growing trade and the need for money led feudal lords to favor money rent, further intensifying peasant exploitation and increasing the conflict between town and country. Classes and estates of feudal society. Two main classes. Feudal society was fundamentally divided into feudal lords, landowners, and peasants. Domination of lords. A small minority of lords held power over the vast majority of peasant serfs. Feudal hierarchy. Feudal lords were ranked in a hierarchical system, with lesser lords, vassals, owing allegiance and service to more powerful lords, barons, seigneurs. Lords as the ruling class. Lords formed the nobility and held significant political and economic privileges, controlling the state. The church's power. The church was a major landowner and held considerable influence alongside the nobility. Peasants at the base. Peasants with limited rights were subservient to their lords and the king, subject to exploitation and even sale. Serfdom as serf slavery. Lenin described serfdom as a form of slavery due to the harsh exploitation and control imposed on peasants. Primary class conflict. The central conflict in feudal society was between the exploiting lords and the exploited peasants. Town power dynamics. In towns, power resided with wealthy merchants and landowners, while craftsmen often struggled against the town elite and sought a voice in governance. Social stratification in towns. Towns developed social hierarchies, with wealthy merchants and masters at the top and journeymen, apprentices, and the poor at the bottom. Urban and rural struggles unite. The struggles of the urban lower classes against exploitation intertwined with the peasants' fight against feudal oppression. Kings with limited early power. While kings held supreme authority in theory, their actual power in early feudalism was often limited, particularly outside their own domains. Decentralized power. Europe was fragmented into numerous small states ruled by powerful feudal lords with extensive autonomy. Feudal conflicts. The complex web of feudal rights and obligations led to frequent disputes and warfare among lords. Development of the productive forces of feudal society. Advancements in feudal production. Feudalism saw significant progress in productive forces compared to slavery. Agricultural improvements. Iron tools became more common. New farming techniques emerged: vine growing, market gardening, and livestock breeding, especially horses, expanded. Craft specialization. Existing crafts were further specialized, leading to new trades like armorer, locksmith, and saddle maker. Technological innovations. The spinning wheel and ribbon loom were introduced, improving textile production. Iron production. Advances in iron smelting and working, including the use of water wheels and blast furnaces, led to better tools and weapons. Gunpowder and firearms. The application of gunpowder in warfare increased the demand for iron and spurred advancements in metalworking. Chinese innovations. China made significant strides in productive forces and culture, pioneering inventions like the compass, gunpowder, paper, and early printing. Growing conflict between forces and relations. The development of productive forces began to clash with the restrictive feudal production relations. Limitations of peasant labor. Feudal exploitation hindered peasant productivity and agricultural output. Constraints on urban crafts. Guild regulations restricted innovation and growth in urban craft production. Stagnation in feudal production. Feudalism was marked by slow production growth, reliance on routine, and adherence to tradition. Need for new production relations. The expanding productive forces required new, more dynamic production relations to further develop. The birth of capitalist production in the womb of the feudal system. Rise of commodity production. Feudalism saw the gradual growth of commodity production, with town crafts expanding and peasant economies increasingly involved in trade. Simple commodity production. This refers to production by small craftsmen and peasants who own their means of production and create goods for exchange through their personal labor. Commodities and the market. Goods produced for exchange are commodities. The market establishes a common value for identical commodities regardless of individual production conditions. Unequal exchange. Producers with better tools and conditions have lower individual labor costs and gain an advantage in the market, while those with less efficient production are disadvantaged. Competition and differentiation. Market competition leads to differentiation among small commodity producers, with the majority becoming impoverished and a few growing wealthy. Feudal barriers to trade. Feudal fragmentation hindered trade through tolls, tributes, and other restrictions imposed by local lords. Need for a national market. Economic development required overcoming feudal barriers and establishing a unified national market. Centralization of state power. The growth of trade and the need for a national market supported the centralization of state power, leading to the rise of absolute monarchies. The role of the bourgeoisie. The emerging town bourgeoisie supported centralized states to remove feudal obstacles to trade. Formation of a world market. The discovery of new sea routes to the east and the Americas shifted the center of European trade and expanded the world market. Impact on craft production. The growing demand for goods fueled by world trade exceeded the capacity of small-scale craft production. Transition to capitalist production. The limitations of craft production accelerated the shift towards large-scale capitalist production based on wage labor. What paths to capitalism? The transition from feudalism to capitalism occurred through the differentiation of small commodity producers into capitalists and wage workers, and through merchant capital directly controlling production. Breakdown of guilds. As markets expanded, competition intensified, and wealthy master craftsmen within guilds adopted capitalist practices, employing more workers and extending working hours. Merchants' role. Merchant capital initially acted as intermediaries in trade, but later merchants, engrossers, began buying goods from producers and selling them on a larger market. Economic dependence. Small producers became dependent on merchants for loans and raw materials, leading to their impoverishment and eventual transformation into wage workers. Putting out system. Merchants evolved into putters out, providing raw materials and sometimes tools to producers who worked from home. Rise of manufactories. Craftsmen were brought together in workshops, where the division of labor was introduced, leading to the development of manufactories, capitalist enterprises with hand-based production. Spread of manufactories. Manufactories emerged first in Italy and later spread throughout Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries, focusing on various industries like textiles, arms, and glass. Manufactories in Russia. Russia saw the rise of manufactories in the 17th century, often relying on serf labor, with free-wage labor becoming more common later. Breakdown of feudal relations in agriculture. Money payments replaced payments in kind, increasing peasants' need for money and making them vulnerable to exploitation by merchants and usurers. Differentiation of the peasantry. The growth of money relations led to the stratification of the peasantry, with most becoming impoverished and a small group of kulaks, wealthy peasants, emerging. Capitalism within feudalism. Capitalist production relations developed within the feudal system, gradually undermining and eventually replacing it. Primitive capital accumulation. Forcible seizure of peasant lands preconditions for capitalist production. Capitalism requires a pool of propertyless, free laborers who must sell their labor to capitalists, and the accumulation of capital to establish large enterprises. Violence in the transition to capitalism. While capitalism emerged from the internal contradictions of feudalism, the process was accelerated by the use of force and violence by landowners, the bourgeoisie, and the state. Debunking the idyllic narrative. The idea that capitalism arose from the virtues of hard work and saving is a myth propagated by bourgeois historians. Primitive accumulation. The historical process of separating producers from their means of production, land, tools, etc., involved widespread violence, theft, and exploitation. England's early capitalist development. England was a pioneer in capitalist development, starting in the late 15th century with the forced expulsion of peasants from their land. Enclosure movement. Driven by the demand for wool, landlords seized common lands and converted them into pastures for sheep, displacing peasants and destroying their homes. State-sanctioned plunder. The state supported the enclosure movement through legislation, legalizing the theft of peasant lands. Consequences for the peasantry. The dispossessed peasants were left impoverished and often became beggars, facing persecution and brutal punishment under vagabondage laws. Brutal enforcement. The state used violence to suppress resistance to the enclosure movement and enforce laws against the displaced population, with tens of thousands executed for vagrancy. Capitalism's requirements. Capitalist production needs two things. 1. A large number of propertyless, free laborers forced to work for capitalists, and 2. Accumulated wealth to create large-scale capitalist enterprises. Slow organic development versus rapid forceful change. While capitalism could arise organically from small-scale commodity production, the process was too slow for the demands of the expanding world market. Therefore, violence and force were used to accelerate the transition. Primitive accumulation in Russia. Tsarist Russia followed the same pattern of separating producers from their means of production. The 1861 abolition of serfdom, while granting personal freedom, involved massive land seizures from peasants, forcing them into exploitative labor arrangements and debt. Land seizure and its dual purpose. The forceful eviction of peasants served two purposes. 1. It transformed feudal land ownership into private bourgeois property, and 2. It created a large pool of landless laborers for capitalist industries. Sources of capitalist wealth. Early capitalists amassed wealth through various means, including trade, usury, and colonial exploitation. Colonial plunder. The conquest of the Americas, the African slave trade, and the exploitation of colonies generated enormous wealth for European merchants and companies. East India companies. These state-supported companies held monopolies over colonial trade, ruthlessly exploiting resources and people for massive profits. Exploitation in Russia. In Russia, merchants profited from exploitative trade practices in Siberia and through state-granted liquor monopolies. Blood and dirt of capital accumulation. Marx famously described the process of primitive accumulation as being drenched in blood and dirt due to the violence, exploitation, and suffering it entailed. The birth of capitalist production in the womb of the feudal system. Rise of simple commodity production. Feudalism saw the growth of small-scale production by craftsmen and peasants who owned their means of production and created goods for market exchange. Competition and inequality. Differences in production methods and individual skills led to varying labor costs for the same commodities. This resulted in market competition favoring efficient producers, leading to wealth accumulation for some and ruin for others. Feudal barriers to trade. Feudal lords hindered trade through tolls and restrictions, stifling economic growth. Centralization of state power. The need for a unified market and the removal of feudal barriers led to the rise of absolute monarchies supported by the emerging bourgeoisie. The world market emerges. The search for new trade routes after the fall of Constantinople led to the discovery of America and a sea route to India, shifting trade dominance towards the Atlantic and fueling demand for goods. Transition to capitalism. Growing world trade and demand overwhelmed small-scale production, accelerating the shift towards large-scale capitalist production reliant on wage labor. Two paths to capitalism. Feudalism transitioned to capitalism through both the internal differentiation of small producers into capitalists and wage workers, and through the external influence of merchant capital. Guilds and competition. Early guilds limited competition, but growing markets intensified it, leading richer craftsmen to adopt capitalist practices and become employers, while others became wage workers. Merchants and the breakdown of feudalism. Merchants initially facilitated trade, but eventually became engrossers, controlling production by providing raw materials and loans to craftsmen, ultimately transforming them into wage workers. Rise of manufactories. Capitalist workshops emerged where wage workers performed specialized tasks under a division of labor, increasing production efficiency. Manufactories in Russia. Russia saw a similar rise of manufactories, initially relying on serf labor before transitioning to free wage labor. Capitalism in the countryside. Money replaced in-kind payments, forcing peasants to sell goods and increasing their dependence on merchants and lenders. This led to peasant differentiation, with some becoming wealthy while most were impoverished. Capitalism from feudalism. The transition to capitalism occurred within the feudal system itself, driven by the growth of commodity production, merchant capital, and the resulting social and economic changes. Peasant-serf risings. Bourgeois revolutions. Fall of the feudal system, peasant uprisings. Throughout the feudal era, peasants revolted against oppressive conditions. Notable uprisings included the Jacquerie in France, Wat Tyler's Rebellion in England, and movements led by Thomas Munzer in Germany, Stepan Razin and Emelian Pugachev in Russia, and the Taiping in China. Role of peasant revolts. These revolts weakened feudalism and contributed to the eventual abolition of serfdom. Bourgeois revolutions. The rising bourgeoisie exploited peasant struggles to overthrow feudalism and establish capitalist systems in Western Europe, as seen in the Netherlands, England, and France. Limitations of peasant movements. Peasant uprisings were often spontaneous and lacked centralized leadership and a clear program, hindering their long-term success. The rise of capitalism. Capitalism emerged within feudal society, driven by a new class of capitalists and a growing proletariat. Bourgeoisie and the forces of production. The bourgeoisie used the inherent contradiction between evolving forces of production and outdated feudal relations to justify their overthrow of the old order. Triumph of capitalism. Bourgeois revolutions ultimately dismantled feudalism and established the dominance of capitalism. Economic views of the feudal period. Feudal ideology. Economic thought in the feudal period was heavily influenced by religion and the social hierarchy. Confucianism in China. Confucianism reinforced feudal social structures, emphasizing obedience to superiors. It was used by ruling classes to maintain control and perpetuate the feudal system. Thomas Aquinas in Europe. Aquinas justified feudalism through divine law, accepting social stratification and advocating for a just price, reflecting labor and social status. Religious form of class struggle. Early class struggle often manifested in religious forms, with peasant demands rooted in religious texts and the rise of various sections. Radicalization of peasant movements. As peasant revolts intensified, demands shifted towards social equality and even community of property, reflecting a desire for a more just society. Utopian socialists. Thinkers like Thomas More and Tommaso Campanella envisioned ideal societies free from private property and inequality, offering early critiques of social ills. Mercantilism. With the rise of capitalism, mercantilism emerged, focusing on accumulating wealth through trade, particularly gold and silver. Mercantilists advocated for state intervention in the economy and protectionist policies. Mercantilism in Russia. Russian mercantilists emphasized the development of industry and agriculture alongside trade, reflecting the country's unique economic conditions. Critics of feudalism in Russia. Thinkers like Ayn Radishev and the Decembrists challenged serfdom and advocated for its abolition, contributing to the growing revolutionary movement in Russia. Bourgeois ideology. The rising bourgeoisie championed ideas against feudalism and religion, promoting progressive concepts that fueled the bourgeois revolutions and influenced advancements in science and art.